So for whatever reason, I've always enjoyed making lists throughout my life. Like favorite movies, favorite TV shows, favorite concerts I've been to, whatever. So much so that for a while I had this group text going between me and a few friends where we were trying to figure out the 100 greatest bands of all time. Now, it didn't go very well. There was a lot of arguing. No one could agree on anything. Eventually, I had to just put a stop to that text chat. But so yeah, anyways, I've always enjoyed making these lists, and I thought, why not make some videos about it and put it on YouTube so all of you can go to the comments and tell me that I'm wrong. All right, so for the first video, we're gonna start with a pretty easy one. I mean, making these lists, at least for me, is never really easy. I have a lot of trouble deciding, but you know, I think the ones that involve music are always a lot harder for me. But for this first list video, we're gonna do my top 20 favorite movies of all time. Now, there's a few things that I want you to keep in mind before we get started. First of all, these lists aren't really in any particular order. I mean, the idea is to go from my least favorite movie on the list to my favorite movie on the list, but they're not really in order, except for probably the top 5. I'd say the top 5 is, you know, that's pretty solid. Another thing to keep in mind is this is my top 20 favorite movies of all time, not the 20 greatest movies of all time. So therefore, I can't really be wrong because this is my top 20 favorite movies. But I'm sure some of you will still tell me in the comments that I'm wrong, and that's okay. I expect it. That's part of the fun. And one more thing to keep in mind is I tend to like comedies, especially stupid and cheesy comedies. So if you're expecting to see a lot of Oscar-nominated, classic, drama, serious movies on this list, that's probably not gonna happen. When I was putting this list together, the way that I determine what my favorite movies are movies that I could watch over and over again and never get tired of them, and movies that I could quote from beginning to end and that I tend to still quote to this day in my everyday life. And there's a lot of them. So, all right, let's get started with the list.
Number 20.
All right, here we go, number 20, and we're coming in strong. One of the biggest movies of the 80s, at least when it comes to the 80s teen movies. I think this is a lot of people's favorite movie, and I'm talking about 1985's The Breakfast Club. So many great lines in this movie, such an amazing cast, and I think The Breakfast Club is a perfect example of what an amazing director and writer John Hughes is, because almost this entire movie takes place in one room. And I think that's pretty amazing, because if I didn't know anything about The Breakfast Club and you told me to watch the movie and I was like, oh yeah, sure, what's it about? And you said, well, it's about 5 teenagers sitting in one room and talking for an hour and a half, I'd be like, okay, yeah, I'll pass. John Hughes put together such a great script, and then his directing skills, and then of course also the cast too, an amazing cast. The fact that they were able to make sitting in one room so entertaining, you know, it just says a lot about all of them.
Number 19.
All right, so for number 19, this one probably says less about what an amazing movie it is and more about how much skateboarding meant to me as a kid. I am talking about Gleaming the Cube, starring Christian Slater. Not saying that it's not a great movie, it is, but I could understand how maybe the average person who wasn't involved in skateboarding wouldn't think that this is quite as good a movie as I do. But being someone that grew up skateboarding and has been obsessed with skateboarding most of their life, my whole life, anything that had to do with skateboarding, whether it was a music video, a commercial, whatever it was, I loved it. I was all about it. So that's why I love Gleaming the Cube. Seen it more times than I could count. I still watch it all the time. I still quote it all the time. I can quote this movie from beginning to end.
Number 18.
So as you might have already guessed, The Breakfast Club is not going to be the only John Hughes movie on this list. He's one of my favorite writer and directors, so there'll be quite a few of his movies on here. And for number 18, we've got another one of his films. I'm talking about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, an absolutely fantastic movie. John Candy and Steve Martin, two of the best comedic actors of all time. There's one reason that this movie is not higher on my list. Life is already sad enough, and part of the reason I watch movies is to not think about that sadness, and so I don't want to be sad when I watch movies. And Planes, Trains, and Automobiles makes me cry like a baby. Most of the movie is funny, but that whole ending, it gets me every time. But it is undeniably one of John Hughes' best movies. John Candy and Steve Martin are such a great team, and there are so many amazing quotes from this movie. One in particular that my brother and I used to say all the time when we were kids.
Those aren't pillows. Number 17.
Okay, so we've got our first 90s movie on the list, and I think this actually might be the only 90s movie on this list. So in 1991, a movie came out that stirred up the nation. I really wanted to go see it in the movie theater, but my dad wouldn't let me because it was all over the news that people were getting killed in the movie theater. There were fights, and so I had to wait for it to come on HBO. And then once it did, I recorded it. I watched it all the time. I loved it. And of course, I'm talking about 1991's Boys in the Hood, written and directed by John Singleton. And did you know that this is actually John Singleton's first movie that he wrote and directed? I mean, what an amazing movie to have be your first. So the story goes, John Singleton was working as, I believe, a PA on the Arsenio Hall show, and Ice Cube was the musical guest. And John Singleton pulled him aside and said, hey man, I'm working on this movie and I'm gonna put you in it. You're gonna be the star. And Ice Cube was like, okay, sounds good, thanks. And sure enough, as promised, he made Boys in the Hood and he put Ice Cube in the movie. And this was actually Ice Cube's first movie as well. Now, after Boys in the Hood, John Singleton continued to crank out amazing movies, a great TV show as well, Snowfall, which he was actually working on when he passed away, which is a total shame because I think John Singleton had a lot more amazing movies to give us.
Number 16.
Guess who's back again? That's right, John Hughes. For number 16, we're talking about, funny enough, 16 Candles. This is actually, well, I'd say this is my second favorite John Hughes movie. I think Anthony Michael Hall is amazing in this movie. I actually think Anthony Michael Hall was amazing in all of his 80s movies. As much as I think Molly Ringwald's great in this too, I think Anthony Michael Hall actually makes this movie, along with Joan Cusack, even though she has a very small part, but her part is one of my favorite things in this movie.
Yeah.
Number 15.
If you were to ask people what their favorite 80s movies are, or just to name 80s movies for you, I think this is one that would come up over and over again because it was just such a huge movie in the 80s. And being from Reseda, this has to be one of my favorite movies. Of course, I'm talking about The Karate Kid. All right, so I guess there are a few movies on my list that aren't comedies. Boys in the Hood and now Karate Kid. Although there are some funny parts in this movie.
Bike! I hate this freaking bike! This stupid bike!
Okay, maybe that part wasn't supposed to be funny, but I still laugh.
Number 14.
So I am not a big action movie guy. I know most guys love action movies. There are a few that I like, Die Hard, Lethal Weapon. However, there is one action movie that falls into my top 20, and I'm talking about Commando, the greatest action movie of all time. Now, one of the things that I like about this movie is it's got an amazing scene at the Sherman Oaks Galleria, which to me is the ultimate 80s mall. I miss that mall so much. But it's got so many great scenes, so many amazing quotes, so many amazing Arnie lines.
1 minute. Let's party.
Number 13.
So this is gonna be the first Tom Hanks movie on the list, which is kind of surprising because he's one of my favorite actors and I love a lot of his movies, but surprisingly, a lot of his movies didn't make it into my top 20. But he did make the number 13 slot, which is kind of funny because this is a spooky comedy and I'm talking about The Burbs. So The Burbs is a hilarious movie with a great cast. Tom Hanks, Carrie Fisher, Rick Dukerman, Corey Feldman, Courtney Gaines as Hans, the next door neighbor. This is another one that the entire movie is filmed on one neighborhood block. The entire thing was filmed on what's now known as Wisteria Lane at Universal Studios. At the time, it was Colonial Street. But yeah, about 95% of the movie is filmed out there on Wisteria Lane, with just a few scenes filmed inside of their houses.
Friend of yours?
No, it's Guillermo de Frame.
Number 12.
Now for this next movie, I'm going to take a wild guess that most of you watching this video are not going to know what this is, or at least have never seen it. But for me, this is a childhood favorite that to this day I still absolutely love. Talking about Crush Groove. Now, if you've never seen Crush Groove, it's loosely based on the story of Russell Simmons and Def Jam Records. It stars Blair Underwood as Russell. Also, Rick Rubin plays himself. It also stars Run DMC, the Fat Boys, Curtis Blow, and Sheila E. It also features LL Cool J, the Beastie Boys, New Edition. But yeah, it's one of the greatest hip hop movies of all time. I'm sure some people would argue that they like Beat Street more. I love Beat Street, but for me, it's all about Crush Groove.
Number 11.
Okay, so for this next one, we've got another movie that is not a comedy, and it's actually a pretty heavy movie, although it does have some funny parts, definitely not a comedy. And I'm talking about Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. Now, personally, I am not a huge Spike Lee fan. I do think he's put out some good stuff. I really like him as Mars Blackman.
You know who the best player in the game is? Me, Mars Blackman.
However, I think Do the Right Thing is an amazing movie. It's a classic that everybody should see. And this is another one where the entire movie takes place on one block, and it's a real block in Bed-Stuy. And I just think that's so amazing that you can make such a great movie without going to all these different locations, without any special effects. And I think that really shows what an amazing storyteller Spike Lee is.
Number 10.
Now this next one, not only is it in my top 10, but it's also my favorite horror movie and my favorite vampire movie. Of course, I'm talking about The Lost Boys. Now, in my opinion, The Lost Boys is a perfect vampire movie. It's also very 80s, which of course I love, and it's got the two Coreys in it, which is also very 80s. And just so you know, the two Coreys are probably going to be popping up again in our top 10.
Number 9.
Now, you might be a little surprised that this next one isn't a bit higher on my list. And I gotta be honest with you, I'm surprised that this one isn't higher on my list because I love this movie so much, and I'm talking about Peewees Big Adventure. So I am a lifelong Pee-wee fan. I have been a Pee-wee fan for as long as I can remember. Anything that he was involved in, I was all about it. I've talked before about how the movie Back to the Beach, the only reason that I saw that movie is that they showed Pee Wee Herman in the commercial, so I had to see it. So everything that Pee Wee Herman did, I loved. And Paul Reubens did a lot of great things with the Pee Wee Herman character, but I think Pee-wee's Big Adventure was his best. His timing, his delivery, it was perfect. And another thing about Pee-wee's Big Adventure is there's no other actor that could have made this movie. They could have took that same script and gave it to any other actor on the planet, and they would have not been able to pull it off. It makes me think about how in the 2000s, Paul Reubens was talking about how he wanted to make more Pee Wee Herman movies, but he didn't feel like he could play the character the same anymore. So he was shopping it around to different actors, and he even offered it to Johnny Depp. And I cannot tell you how glad I am that that never happened. No one can play Pee Wee Herman except for Paul Reubens, and no one could have done Big Adventure except for Pee Wee.
Number 8.
So I think number 8's a bit underrated, but being from the San Fernando Valley, this has to be one of my favorites, and I'm talking about Valley Girl. Nicolas Cage, Deborah Foreman, E.G. Daily. Oh hey, 2 E.G. Daily movies in a row. So Valley Girl is a total 80s classic. But like I said, I feel like it's a bit underrated. There's a lot of people that I've tried to talk to about this movie, and I'm talking about people that are fans of 80s stuff, and they don't know what Valley Girl is, or at least they've never seen it. But to me, that is crazy because, like I said, this is a total 80s classic and a must if you're from the San Fernando Valley.
Number 7.
So like I've talked about before, growing up, skateboarding was everything to me. So when Thrashin' came out, I could not have been more hyped on this movie. I recorded it off of cable and watched it constantly. Now, I know a lot of pro skateboarders and also people that are in this movie like to make fun of it. They like to talk about how bad it is, but I really don't understand that. I think they don't understand how much this movie meant to people like me when we were growing up. To have a real movie that was representing skateboarding. It meant everything to us. I still love this movie. I still watch it multiple times a year. And I think out of all the movies on my list, I quote this one more than any of them.
Number 6.
Believe it or not, we got another non-comedy, and this is another one that I wanted to watch so bad when it came out, but there was no way my dad was gonna let me go see this in the theater. This is another one that was all over the news. There was violence breaking out at all the theaters, so I had to wait for it to come on cable. And not only did I watch this with my parents when it premiered on cable, but they also let me invite a friend over, and it was a girl. And keep in mind, we were about 10 years old, and still to this day, I think about how awkward it was watching some of those scenes with my parents and a 10-year-old girl. But regardless of that, it's still one of my favorite movies, and I'm talking about Colors. I still watch this movie over and over and over again. I still quote Colors over and over again. I quote Colors constantly. And also, this movie had an amazing soundtrack. We played that album so much when we were kids.
Number 5.
Now, although this next one is 5th on my list, I'm gonna be honest, to me, this is almost a perfect movie, and I'm talking about Back to the Future. And I really don't know what else to say about this one. Like I said, I think this is a perfect movie. Everything about it is amazing. And the sequels too. There's not a lot of movies where the sequels are as good or almost as good as the first one. But for me, and I know a lot of people are not gonna agree with this, but for me, part 2 is almost as good as the original. I'm not as big a fan of part 3, but I still like it. All 3 movies are amazing. So yeah, Back to the Future, perfect movie. Does anybody disagree?
Number 4.
Well, I told you the 2 Corys would be back, and in the number 4 slot, we've got License to Drive. To me, License to Drive is such an 80s movie. I think it's because of the 2 Corys, the white VW, the Ferrari. The music in the movie is so 80s. Just everything about this movie is so 80s. I can't express to you how much I love this movie. I think this is the 2 Corys' best movie, of course, with the Lost Boys being a close second. They're like neck and neck, but yeah, I love License to Drive.
Number 3.
I feel like a lot of people are gonna agree about number 3. This is a must when you're talking about 80s movies. Fast Times at Ridgemont High, a total 80s teen classic comedy. Endless quotes in this movie. I have seen this movie more times than I could ever count. And anytime you say to me, let's watch Fast Times at Ridgemont High, the answer is always gonna be yes. This has gotta be Sean Penn's best role, with Colors being second. But when it comes to Fast Times at Ridgemont High, there's only one thing to say.
Hey, bud, let's party.
Number 2.
So for number 2, I could see a lot of people not really understanding this one, like why this one would be number 2 for me, but I can't really explain it. This is just a movie that I have watched countless times. I never get tired of it. I could watch it and then 2 weeks later, someone could say, hey, let's watch this movie. And I would be like, yep, put it on. I'm talking about Can't Buy Me Love. I don't know why, but this is another one for me that is just so 80s. When I watch this movie, it just gives me that late 80s vibe. I love it so much. I quote this movie all the time. Patrick Dempsey's best movie for sure. This is another one with Courtney Gaines in it. How many movies on this list? Oh, we got Can't Buy Me Love, The Burbs, Colors. I know there was something else on this list that had Courtney Gaines in it. He's showing up a lot. But yeah, Can't Buy Me Love. I love, love, love this movie.
Number 1.
So we've done it. We've finally reached the end of the list. Number 1. Most of you already know what it is because I've talked about it many times. Another John Hughes movie. John Hughes, written, directed by Harold Ramis. You see the poster there behind me. We're talking about National Lampoon's Vacation, the original Vacation, taking the whole family to Wally World. I could not tell you how many times I've seen this movie. I started watching it when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and not a really good movie for a 6-year-old to be watching, but I've watched it probably hundreds of times since then, and I never tire of it. To me, this is a perfect comedy. Another Anthony Michael Hall movie, obviously. This is my favorite Anthony Michael Hall movie. Chevy Chase at his prime, and John Candy. I mean, you have those 3 in a movie together, and you can't go wrong. All right, that is gonna do it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and let me know if you wanna see me do more of these list videos. As always, Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.